Welcome, dear traveler, to another long journey into the depths of ancient story. As the evening settles around us like a soft cloak woven from twilight itself, we prepare to descend together into one of mythology's most profound landscapes. The rivers of the Greek underworld, those eternal waterways that have flowed through human imagination for thousands upon thousands of years. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, whether you're nestled in familiar sheets or perhaps finding comfort in an unfamiliar place, whether the moon outside your window is waxing or waning, whether rain patters against the glass or stars peek through clear skies. Wherever you are, you've chosen to spend these next 3 hours exploring the mysterious waters that the ancient Greeks believed separated our world from the realm of shadows. And I am deeply honored to be your guide through these mythic currents. Here on Boring Mythology, we take our time with these ancient tales, letting them unfold at the pace of dreams themselves, allowing each detail to settle into consciousness like sediment, settling to a riverbed after the current has passed. Tonight, we journey to a place where 5 rivers converge and diverge, where each waterway carries its own particular cargo of meaning, where the ferryman's oar dips into waters that have witnessed every human soul's passage from light into shadow. These are not merely rivers in any ordinary sense. They are boundaries and bridges, barriers and passages, each one a different meditation on what it means to cross from one state of being into another. Picture, if you will, a landscape that exists not quite in our world and not quite beyond it, a geography mapped not by compass and chart, but by the deeper currents of human understanding about death, memory, oath, and transformation. The ancient Greeks, in their profound wisdom, understood that death was not a single event, but a journey, not a wall, but a series of thresholds, each one requiring its own particular toll, its own specific crossing. The air here carries a different quality than the air of the upper world. It is neither warm nor cold, but something between and beyond temperature. A medium through which sound travels differently, where echoes last longer than they should, where whispers carry farther than shouts. The light, too, defies ordinary description. It is not the absence of sunlight, but rather a different kind of illumination altogether, as if the darkness itself possessed a subtle luminescence, as if shadows could cast their own faint glow. As we begin our descent, following paths worn smooth by countless feet across countless ages, we can already hear the first murmurings of water in the distance. Water, that most fundamental element, that substance which comprises most of our living bodies, that medium which both sustains life and, in these deeper realms, demarcates the boundaries of life itself. The sound is not quite what you might expect from earthly rivers. It carries notes and undertones that earthly water never quite achieves, sometimes like distant singing, sometimes like whispered conversations in languages older than Greek itself, sometimes like the sound of time itself, flowing from future through present into past. The path beneath our feet, and we do have feet in this journey, phantom feet that leave no prints but feel every texture of the way. This path is neither rough nor smooth, but something that shifts with each step, responding to our passage like a living thing. Sometimes it feels like polished marble, worn by ages of travelers before us. Sometimes it feels like packed earth, dense with the weight of millennia. Sometimes it seems to be made of something that has no earthly equivalent, a substance that exists only here, in this space between spaces. To our left and right, the landscape unfolds in ways that challenge ordinary perception. There are trees here, or things like trees, whose leaves rustle with sounds like ancient papyrus being turned by invisible readers. Their bark, if bark it is, seems to contain patterns that shift when you're not looking directly at them. Patterns that might be writing in scripts forgotten before the first human cities rose from dust, or might simply be the natural whirls and grooves that wood takes when it grows in a place where different laws govern growth itself. We will encounter, in our long journey tonight, the 5 great rivers that define this realm's geography. First among them, the Styx, that river of oaths whose waters bind even the gods themselves to their sworn words, whose current runs so deep and still that its surface mirrors not the sky above, but something else entirely. Something that might be the weight of every promise ever made and ever broken. The Styx does not flow so much as presents itself across the landscape, a barrier and a bond, a boundary that once crossed cannot be uncrossed. Then we will find the Acheron, the river of woe. Though woe is perhaps too simple a translation for the particular quality of sorrow that these waters carry. This is not the sharp grief of fresh loss, but something older, deeper, more worn. Like river stones that have been smoothed by centuries of current until they're perfect in their simplicity. The Acheron flows with the accumulated weight of every ending, every goodbye, every last glance backward at what must be left behind. The Lethe awaits us too, that river of forgetting whose waters offer what might be mercy or might be loss, depending on one's perspective. To drink from Lethe is to release the burden of memory, to let go of all that tethered the soul to its former life. Some approach these waters eagerly, ready to surrender the weight of remembrance. Others resist until the very last moment, clinging to memories even when those memories bring more pain than comfort. The Lethe flows with a particular quality of quiet, as if the very sound of its current could erase thoughts before they're fully formed. We will stand beside the Phlegethon, the river of fire that burns but does not consume, whose flames are made of something that is both fire and water, simultaneously defying the physics of the upper world. The Phlegethon's fire is not the destroying flame of earthly conflagration, but something more akin to purification, transformation, the kind of heat that changes the very nature of what passes through it. Its light illuminates the underworld in ways that reveal things hidden in ordinary darkness. Truths that can only be seen by firelight, that burns without fuel, without smoke, without ash. And we will hear the lamentations of Cocytus, the river of wailing, though again our earthly words fail to capture the particular quality of sound that rises from these waters. This is not simply the sound of mourning, but something more complex. The voice of everything that was never said, every word that should have been spoken but wasn't, every cry that was stifled, every song that was never sung. The Cocytus carries the echo of unexpressed emotions, the weight of all that remained locked in hearts until it was too late for speaking. Between and among these rivers, we will encounter the figure of Charon, that ancient ferryman whose boat has never needed repair, though it has sailed these waters since before memory began. Charon, whose face has been described 1,000 different ways by 1,000 different witnesses, and yet no two descriptions quite agree. Some say he is terrible to behold, others that he possesses a strange and melancholy beauty. Perhaps he appears differently to each soul, showing them what they need to see, or what they fear to see, or what they're ready to see. We will explore the banks and bridges, those liminal spaces where one realm touches another, where the geography becomes uncertain and malleable. These shores are not made of sand or stone, but of something more fundamental. Compressed time, perhaps, or crystallized possibility, or the physical manifestation of transition itself. To walk along these banks is to experience a peculiar sensation of being neither here nor there, neither arriving nor departing, suspended in an eternal moment of crossing. The bridges that span these waters are architectural impossibilities that nonetheless stand firm beneath the weight of souls. Some are vast constructions that seem to stretch into forever, their far ends lost in mist that might be distance or might be time itself growing hazy. Others are narrow, precarious things that require careful navigation, where each step must be deliberate and conscious. Still others appear and disappear according to laws that no living mind has ever fully comprehended, present only when needed, absent when their purpose has been fulfilled. Throughout this underworld, there is a quality of atmosphere that defies simple description. The air, if air it is, carries scents that trigger memories you didn't know you had. Sometimes the smell of earth after rain, sometimes the faint sweetness of flowers that bloomed before human beings walked upright. Sometimes something metallic and sharp, like the taste of coins placed on the tongues of the dead. These scents come and go like thoughts themselves, never quite graspable, never entirely absent. The sounds of this realm layer upon each other in ways that create a constant, subtle music. Beneath the obvious sounds of flowing water, there are deeper notes. The sound of stones settling over millennia, the whisper of shadows moving across surfaces that have never known sunlight, the faint echo of every footstep that has ever passed this way. Sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear what might be voices, though whether they come from the past, present, or future remains forever uncertain. As we prepare to begin our journey in earnest, to step from this liminal entrance space into the realm proper, take a moment to feel yourself settling into the rhythm of this different world. Let your breathing slow to match the patient pace of rivers that have flowed since the cosmos was young. Let your heartbeat synchronize with the deeper pulse of waters that know no urgency, no haste, only the eternal continuation of their appointed courses. The ancient Greeks understood something profound when they imagined death's realm as a place of rivers rather than walls, of flowing rather than stillness. They understood that even in ending there is movement, even in conclusion there is continuation. The rivers of Hades do not stop. They flow eternally, carrying their particular cargoes through landscapes that exist outside of time as we understand it, maintaining their courses through a geography that maps the human soul's journey from known to unknown, from being to becoming, from what was to what might be. The first river reveals itself not with sound, but with sensation, a particular quality in the air that tells you you're approaching something significant, something that commands respect not through force, but through sheer presence. The atmosphere grows denser here, not oppressively so, but with a weight that makes each breath feel more deliberate, more conscious. You find yourself naturally slowing your pace, not from fear, but from a kind of automatic reverence, the way one might slow when entering an ancient cathedral or approaching a memorial to events too vast for ordinary comprehension. First, the temperature shifts, neither warming nor cooling, but becoming something outside the normal spectrum of hot and cold, as if the very concept of temperature ceases to apply in the ordinary way. Then the light changes, taking on a quality like moonlight reflected off deep water. Though there is no moon here, no sky in any conventional sense. The illumination seems to come from the river itself, or perhaps from the space between the river and everything else. That boundary zone where one reality meets another. The ground beneath your feet begins to slope downward, so gradually you barely notice at first, just a subtle tilting that draws you forward and down, until you realize you've descended farther than seemed possible given the gentle grade. The path here is wide and well-worn, polished by countless passages, yet each footstep feels like the first, as if the path reforms itself behind each traveler, eternal, yet ever new. Then you see it, the Styx, stretching before you like a ribbon of liquid night. Though night is not quite the right word for the particular quality of darkness that these waters possess. This is not the absence of light, but rather a different kind of presence, substantial and tangible. The surface of the river moves without seeming to flow, a paradox that makes perfect sense when you observe it, but defies explanation when you try to put it into words. The Styx is wider than you expected, wider than seemed possible from the stories, stretching from shore to shore with a breadth that seems to expand and contract, depending on the angle of observation. Sometimes it appears crossable in a few strong strokes. Other times it seems to span horizons, an ocean compressed into the form of a river. This mutability is not disturbing, but rather feels entirely appropriate, as if a river that binds oaths should naturally resist being bound itself to any single form. The water, if water is what we should call this substance that flows yet doesn't flow, that moves yet remains still, possesses a quality unlike any earthly river. Its surface is perfectly smooth, unnaturally smooth, smoother than any water has a right to be. No wind disturbs it, no current creates ripples, no debris mars its perfect plane. It reflects, but what it reflects is not the sky above, for there is no sky here in any conventional sense. Instead, the surface shows something else, something that might be the weight of words, the substance of promises, the form that oaths take when they become more than mere speech. Along the banks, peculiar vegetation grows, plants that exist nowhere in the upper world. These are not quite trees, not quite reeds, but something between and beyond both. Their leaves, if leaves they are, shimmer with a subtle iridescence, as if each one were inscribed with microscopic text in languages that predate human speech. When what passes for wind in this place moves through them, they create a sound like whispered conversations, like secrets being shared just below the threshold of understanding. The Styx carries within its current the power of the unbreakable oath. When the gods themselves swear by these waters, they bind themselves to their words with chains stronger than adamant, more enduring than the mountains, more inexorable than time itself. To break such an oath is to invite a punishment that makes ordinary suffering seem like comfort. A year of breathlessness, 9 years of exile from the divine feast and council, a separation from one's very nature that leaves even immortals diminished. But the power of the Styx extends beyond mere punishment for oath-breaking. These waters carry within them the very essence of commitment, of words given weight and substance, of promises transformed from air into architecture. Every oath ever sworn by these waters continues to exist within them, creating layers upon layers of accumulated intention, determination, desperation. The river remembers every promise, holds every vow, maintains every covenant in its liquid memory. Standing beside the Styx, you can feel this accumulated weight of sworn words. It presses against consciousness like depth presses against a diver, not painful, but absolutely present, undeniable. Some say that if you listen carefully, you can hear the echoes of every oath ever sworn by these waters, from the cosmic promises of the Titans to the desperate vows of heroes, to the quiet commitments of ordinary souls who found themselves, through circumstance or choice, standing where you stand now. The ferryman's dock extends into the river here. Though dock seems too mundane a word for this construction that exists partly in the physical realm and partly in something beyond physicality. It's made of wood that might have come from trees that grew before the separation of earth and sky, planks that bear the marks of age without showing any sign of decay. The structure extends exactly as far as it needs to, no more, no less, reaching the precise point where Charon's boat arrives, though how it knows where that point will be remains one of the river's mysteries. Sometimes souls gather here, waiting for passage, though waiting isn't quite accurate either. Time moves differently along the Styx, flowing in eddies and currents that mirror the river's own paradoxical stillness in motion. A soul might stand here for what feels like moments or eons, and both sensations would be equally true. The experience of duration becomes fluid, subjective, measured not in heartbeats or breaths, but in some other metric that belongs only to this place. The Styx serves as more than just a boundary. It's a transformer, a translator, a mechanism by which things of one nature become things of another nature. When a soul crosses these waters, they undergo a fundamental change, not in their essence, but in their state. They transition from being beings of the upper world to beings of the lower world, from participants in sunlight to citizens of shadow. This transformation is neither good nor evil, neither punishment nor reward, but simply a necessary change, as necessary as the change from liquid to vapor, or from seed to plant. The silence around the Styx has a particular quality, dense and full rather than empty. It's not the absence of sound, but rather a presence of quiet so profound that it becomes almost tangible. Within this silence, smaller sounds become magnified. The faint lap of water against the shore that shouldn't exist, given the river's stillness. The distant cry of birds that are not quite birds. The whisper of your own breathing, which seems suddenly loud and significant. Ancient Greeks would come to temples where small portions of Styx water were kept in sacred vessels, brought up from the underworld through rituals whose exact nature has been lost to time. These waters were used in the most solemn ceremonies, the most binding oaths, the most serious moments of civic and religious life. To swear by the Styx was to invoke forces older than the Olympic gods, powers that existed when the cosmos was still finding its form. The mythology tells us that the Styx was the first river to aid Zeus in his war against the Titans, and for this service, she was granted the honor of being the oath river of the gods. But this is mythology's way of explaining something that perhaps existed before explanation, before gods and titans, before the division of the cosmos into sky and earth and underworld. The Styx feels older than these stories, older than the need for stories, as if it existed before existence needed to justify itself through narrative. The water's surface occasionally shows things that are not reflections in any ordinary sense. Sometimes you might glimpse moments, not your own memories, but memories that belong to the river itself, or perhaps memories that belong to no one and everyone simultaneously. A hero raising a sword in oath before battle, a lover promising eternal faithfulness, a merchant swearing to the truth of his scales, a child making a solemn vow to keep a secret. All these moments exist simultaneously in the river's surface, past and present and future collapsed into a single plane of eternal now. The Greeks spoke of Styx as a goddess as well as a river, and standing here, this dual nature makes perfect sense. The river has presence, consciousness, will, not in any anthropomorphic sense, but in a way that transcends human categories of animate and inanimate. The Styx knows things, remembers things, judges things, though its judgment is not moral but rather mechanical, as inevitable as gravity, as impartial as mathematics. The vegetation along the banks grows denser as you walk, these not quite plants reaching toward the river but never quite touching its surface, as if even they understand the boundary that must be maintained. Their roots, when visible, seem to extend not down into earth but sideways into dimensions that the eye cannot quite follow. Some say these plants feed not on nutrients, but on the remnants of broken oaths, growing stronger where promises have been betrayed, though whether this makes them parasites or recyclers remains a matter of philosophical debate. The path along the Styx continues indefinitely in both directions, and walking it, you get the sense that you could follow it forever without reaching either source or mouth. The river seems to exist in a state of eternal middle, always flowing from somewhere to somewhere else, without ever quite arriving at either origin or destination. This eternal continuousness feels appropriate for a river that deals in eternally binding oaths, promises that transcend the normal boundaries of time and mortality. In some places, the path comes so close to the water that you could reach out and touch it, though something, wisdom, instinct, or perhaps the river's own will, prevents you from doing so. The Styx is not meant to be touched casually, not meant to be entered without purpose and preparation. Its waters carry too much power to be treated lightly, too much weight to be disturbed without consequence. The air near the river carries a scent that defies comparison to anything in the upper world. It's not unpleasant, but it's not pleasant either. It simply is a fundamental smell that seems to bypass the nose entirely and register directly in some deeper part of consciousness. Some describe it as metallic, others as floral, still others as something like ozone before a storm. But all these descriptions fail to capture its essential nature. As you continue along the path, you notice that your shadow behaves strangely here. It doesn't always fall where light and geometry suggest it should. Sometimes it seems to lag behind you, as if reluctant to keep pace. Sometimes it pulls ahead, as if eager to reach some destination you're not yet aware of. This is not threatening, merely another aspect of the Styx's influence on the normal rules that govern the upper world. The stories say that Achilles was dipped in the Styx as an infant, making him invulnerable everywhere the waters touched. Only his heel, where his mother held him, remained mortal and vulnerable. This story speaks to the totalizing nature of the Styx's power. It cannot work partially. Either you are touched by it entirely, or you maintain some point of connection to mortality. There is no middle ground with the Styx, no compromise, no negotiation. Like the oaths it witnesses, it deals in absolutes. Birds, or creatures that occupy the ecological niche of birds in this realm, occasionally fly overhead, their wings making sounds that are not quite the sounds of feathers moving through air. They cast shadows that don't quite match their forms, as if shadow and substance have become slightly disconnected in this place. Their calls, when they make them, sound like words in languages that were old when the world was young, communications that bypass the need for translation and speak directly to some pre-verbal understanding. The Styx remembers everything, forgets nothing. Every oath sworn by its waters exists within it still, creating a kind of archaeological record of promise and commitment. If you had the ability to read these waters like a book, you would find within them the entire history of sworn words, from the first promise ever made to the last oath that will be sworn before the cosmos winds down into entropy. But these waters are not meant to be read by mortal minds, or perhaps any minds at all. They simply are, and in their being, they hold the structure of covenant itself. The transition from the Styx to the Acheron happens not abruptly, but through a gradual shift in the quality of everything around you. The air grows heavier, not oppressively so, but with a weight that settles into your chest, like a sigh that never quite completes itself. The perfect stillness of the Styx gives way to something else. Not movement exactly, but a kind of patient waiting, as if the very atmosphere were holding its breath in anticipation of an exhale that never comes. The path winds away from the Oath River, climbing slightly before descending again. And as you walk, you notice the light changing. Where the Styx possessed its own strange luminescence, the approaches to the Acheron are lit by something more like twilight, though not the twilight of any earthly evening. This is the light of endings, of things winding down, of energy dissipating into gentler and gentler forms, until it becomes almost but not quite nothing. You hear the Acheron before you see it, though what you hear is not the sound of water in any conventional sense. It's more like the sound of breathing, of countless lungs drawing in air and releasing it in a collective rhythm that never quite synchronizes. Or perhaps it's the sound of sighing, of the particular exhale that comes when one finally accepts what cannot be changed. The sound draws you forward, not with urgency, but with a kind of inevitable gravity. The way a stone rolls down a gentle slope without haste, but without pause. The vegetation changes too as you approach this second river, where the plants near the Styx stood upright, reaching toward their strange purposes. The growth near the Acheron tends to droop, to bend, to curve earthward as if carrying an invisible weight. These plants, if plants they are, have leaves that shimmer with a different quality than those near the Oath River. These shimmer like tears that haven't quite fallen, like the surface tension of grief, that hasn't quite broken into weeping. Then the river comes into view, and your first impression is of movement so slow it might be stillness, or stillness so patient it might be movement. The Acheron flows, certainly, but its flow has a particular quality of resignation to it, as if the river moves not because it wishes to, but because movement is its nature, and it has accepted this nature with the kind of deep, bone-deep acceptance that comes after all struggle has ceased. The water of the Acheron is darker than the Styx, but it's a different kind of darkness, not the substantial darkness of oath and binding, but the soft darkness of sorrow worn smooth by time. Its surface is not smooth like the Styx's supernatural plane, but rippled with countless tiny movements, as if every drop of water were gently trembling with its own particular grief. These ripples never quite form patterns, never quite achieve regularity, creating a surface that's constantly shifting in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The Acheron is the river of woe, but woe is too simple a word for what these waters carry. This is not the sharp, immediate pain of fresh loss, nor the dramatic anguish of tragedy. This is something quieter, deeper. The ache that settles in after the initial shock has passed. The weight that remains when tears have dried. The hollow that persists when acute grief has transmuted into chronic sorrow. It's the grief that becomes part of your structure, that you carry not as a burden, but as a component of your being. Along the banks of the Acheron, stones lie scattered. Smooth, rounded stones that look as if they've been worn by millennia of water, though the river barely seems to touch them. Each stone is unique, yet they all share a particular quality of weight that seems disproportionate to their size. Pick one up, though you find you don't quite want to, or rather, you want to, but something in you resists, and it feels heavier than it should, as if it carries within it more than just its own mass. The ferryman poles his boat across these waters too, though his passage here has a different quality than on the Styx. On the Oath River, Charon's boat moves with purpose, with the inexorability of sworn words. Here, the boat drifts as much as it's directed, following currents that seem to exist more in emotion than in water. The splash of his pole entering the water sounds like names being spoken, not called, not announced, just quietly acknowledged. The way you might speak the name of someone long gone when you come across their photograph unexpectedly. The Acheron remembers every passage, every soul that has crossed its waters, carrying their particular burden of earthly sorrow. But unlike the Styx, which holds these memories in perfect crystalline clarity, the Acheron's memory is softer, more impressionistic. The river knows the shape of every grief that has touched its waters, but it holds these shapes gently, the way one might hold a bird with a broken wing, firmly enough to prevent further harm, gently enough to avoid causing additional pain. Souls gather at the banks of the Acheron differently than they do at the Styx. At the Oath River, they stand with purpose, with the weight of destiny. Here, they tend to sit, to recline, to assume postures of waiting that suggest they've been waiting for longer than they can remember and expect to wait for longer still. They don't speak much, these waiting souls, but when they do, their words have the quality of thoughts spoken aloud, without expectation of response, observations made to the air itself. The rules of the Acheron, if rules they can be called, are less like laws and more like tendencies, habits that the river has developed over eons of flowing. The river tends to be shallow, where grief is fresh and deep, where sorrow has aged into something else. It tends to flow faster, where many souls have passed recently, and slower, where the banks have been empty for what passes for time in this place. It tends to be warmer, though warm isn't quite right, where love was involved in the sorrow, and cooler, where the grief was more abstract, more philosophical. The Acheron doesn't judge the sorrows it carries. It accepts all grief equally. The monumental losses that reshape entire lives and the small sadnesses that accumulate like dust. The river understands that sorrow is not hierarchical, that a small grief deeply felt can weigh as much as a great tragedy observed from a distance. In its waters, all woe finds its level, all sadness finds its place in the great flow toward whatever ocean accepts such rivers. Sometimes, they say, you can see things in the Acheron's waters, not reflections, not visions, but something between and beyond both. You might see moments of ending, of conclusion, of things that were and now are not. A last conversation that didn't know it was last. A final glimpse of a familiar place. The moment when hope, which had been growing smaller and smaller, finally guttered out entirely. These images appear and disappear like thoughts you're trying not to think, present and absent simultaneously. The texture of the air around the Acheron has a quality that makes breathing feel different, not difficult, but more conscious, as if each breath carries weight beyond mere air. You find yourself breathing more slowly, more deliberately, not from any external compulsion, but because it feels appropriate to the rhythm of this place. The river itself seems to breathe with you, or perhaps you're breathing with it. The distinction becomes unimportant. Trees line the banks here, or things that serve the function of trees, though their bark is smooth as water-worn stone and their leaves hang like tears that have crystallized mid-fall. They don't move with wind. There is no wind here in any earthly sense, but they do move, swaying with some other force, perhaps the collective exhalation of all the sorrows that have passed this way. Their roots, where visible, intertwine beneath the surface in patterns that suggest comfort, as if even the vegetation here understands the need for connection in the face of a grief. The temperature near the Acheron is neither warm nor cold, but something else entirely. Skin temperature, perhaps. Blood temperature. The temperature of tears when they first well up but before they fall. It's a temperature that makes you deeply aware of your own boundaries, of where you end and everything else begins, and yet simultaneously makes those boundaries feel lesser definite, less important. Fragment sentences drift through consciousness here, like the weight of, as if sorrow had, when ending becomes. These incomplete thoughts feel more true than complete sentences would. The Acheron doesn't deal in finished thoughts, in neat conclusions. It deals in the ongoing, the unresolved, the griefs that never quite complete themselves, because completion would mean letting go, and letting go would mean forgetting, and forgetting would mean a second loss more final than the first. The sound of the river is constant but not uniform. Sometimes like rainfall on leaves, sometimes like fabric being slowly torn, sometimes like pages being turned in a book you're not quite ready to finish reading, sometimes like breathing in sleep, irregular but persistent. These sounds layer upon each other without cacophony, creating a symphony of sorrow that's somehow soothing rather than distressing. Touch becomes significant here. The air has texture, soft, like worn cotton, like skin that's been cried on, like letters read so many times the paper has gone soft. The ground beneath your feet yields slightly with each step, not unstable but responsive, as if it remembers every footfall and adjusts itself to provide exactly the support each traveler needs. Even the space between things has a quality of substance, as if absence itself has become tangible. The Acheron's water, if you were to touch it, and something in its nature invites touch in a way the Styx does not, would feel exactly like water should feel, and yet not like any water you've ever touched. It has weight without heaviness, substance without resistance. It clings without being sticky, releases without abandoning. It's the perfect temperature of water that's been cupped in palms, held but not possessed, allowed to flow through fingers that know they cannot keep it. Charon's boat, when it crosses the Acheron, moves through the water without disturbing it overmuch. The wake heals itself almost immediately, the ripples settling back into their perpetual gentle trembling, as if the passage never happened, or as if it's always happening, or as if happening and not happening have become the same thing in this place where time moves like grief, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, sometimes seeming not to move at all. The souls who have crossed the Acheron carry something different in their aspect than those who have only crossed the Styx. The Oath River changes a soul's state, but the River of Woe changes something deeper. Not their essence, but their relationship to their essence. They've passed through the waters that understand sorrow, been touched by the river that remembers every ending, and they emerge, not cleansed exactly, not freed, but somehow more thoroughly themselves, as if grief were a lens that brings certain truths into sharper focus. Stories tell of heroes who crossed the Acheron while still living, and how the experience marked them. Not visibly. There are no scars from water that accepts rather than wounds, but in subtler ways, a different quality to their silence, a particular patience with the sorrows of others, an ability to sit with grief without needing to fix it or flee from it. The Acheron teaches, though what it teaches cannot be put into words, only into presence. The river's course meanders more than the Styx's seemingly straight path. It curves and recurves, loops back on itself, creates oxbows and channels that separate and rejoin. Following its bank, you might walk for what feels like hours, only to find yourself looking across a narrow stretch of water at a place you passed earlier, or think you passed earlier, or might pass later. Linear progression becomes less important than the simple fact of continuing, of putting one foot in front of the other, even when the destination remains unclear. Mist rises from the Acheron at irregular intervals, a mist that's not quite water vapor, not quite anything else. It carries within it the essence of the river, that particular quality of aged sorrow, of grief worn smooth. When this mist touches you, it doesn't dampen so much as it deepens, making everything feel more present, more real, more thoroughly what it is. Colors, such as they are in this twilight realm, become more saturated. Sounds become more resonant. Thoughts become more themselves. The mythology speaks of the Acheron as the river across which all souls must pass, the fundamental crossing from life to death. But standing beside it, you understand it's more than mere passage. It's acknowledgement, recognition. The Acheron sees every sorrow a soul carries and says, wordlessly but unmistakably, yes, this happened. This was real, This mattered. This matters still. The river doesn't judge the grief, doesn't weigh it, doesn't compare it. It simply witnesses, and in witnessing, somehow makes the unbearable bearable. Fragments of sound drift across the water. Not quite music, not quite speech, not quite crying. Something that encompasses all three without being any of them. These sounds seem to come from the river itself, or perhaps from the accumulated memory of every sound of sorrow that has ever been made near water, every tear that has fallen into rivers, every cry that has echoed across lakes, every sigh that has been released beside the sea. The Acheron connects. To other rivers, yes, its waters eventually join with the other rivers of the underworld in ways that mapmakers have never successfully charted. But more than that, it connects every sorrow to every other sorrow, creating a vast network of shared grief that somehow makes each individual grief both larger and smaller. Larger because it's part of something infinite. Smaller because it's shared, distributed, held by waters that have held countless sorrows before and will hold countless sorrows still to come. Near the Acheron, memories behave differently. Not your personal memories. Those remain yours. But the memories that belong to places, to objects, to the space between things. You might suddenly understand the history of a particular stone on the bank. Know without knowing how you know that it has been worn smooth, not by water, but by the touch of countless hands, each one pausing here, resting, gathering strength, or releasing it. These memories don't intrude. They simply become available. Like books on a shelf, you're free to read or ignore. The transition away from the Acheron happens gradually, almost imperceptibly. The quality of sorrow in the air begins to thin, not disappearing, but transforming into something else. The weight in your chest doesn't lift so much as it redistributes, becoming part of your structure rather than your burden. The sound of the river continues long after the river itself is lost to view. A persistent whisper that might be water, might be wind, might be the echo of every goodbye ever spoken, as you prepare to leave the Acheron behind. Though perhaps nothing is ever truly left behind in this realm where all times exist simultaneously. You carry with you something of its nature, not sorrow itself, but an understanding of sorrow. Not grief, but a comprehension of grief's place in the architecture of existence. The Acheron has touched you with waters that remember every ending, and in remembering, somehow transform ending from conclusion into transition. The path continues, winding away from the river of woe toward whatever comes next. But the Acheron's influence lingers, a gentle presence that reminds you everything ends, and endings are not failures, but completions. Every sorrow is temporary, even when it feels eternal. Every grief eventually transforms into something else. Memory, wisdom, compassion, understanding. The river knows this, has always known this, will always know this. And so you continue, carrying within you the quiet weight of the Acheron's teaching, ready for whatever waters await. The approach to Lethe begins not with forgetting, but with remembering. A sudden, almost overwhelming awareness of every memory you carry, as if the proximity to the river of forgetfulness makes memory itself more vivid in its last moments of clarity. The path here is different from the paths that led to the Styx and Acheron. It wanders without apparent purpose, doubles back on itself, presents choices between routes that seem identical, yet feel profoundly different. Walking toward Lethe, You understand that the journey is itself a meditation on memory, what to keep, what to release, what defines us, what confines us. The atmosphere around Lethe has a quality of suspension, as if time has become viscous, flowing like honey rather than water. Each moment stretches longer than it should, allowing space for contemplation, for the kind of deep consideration that the upper world, with its relentless forward momentum, rarely permits. Here, you can hold a thought like a physical object, turn it over, examine it from every angle, feel its weight and texture before deciding whether to carry it forward or let it go. The first glimpse of Lethe is always unexpected, no matter how prepared you think you are. The river appears suddenly around a bend, or perhaps it was always there, and your eyes simply weren't ready to see it until this exact moment. It flows with a different quality than either the Styx or the Acheron, neither the supernatural stillness of oath water, nor the gentle grief of the river of woe. Lethe flows like thought itself, sometimes swift and clear, sometimes slow and dreamlike, always changing, never quite the same river twice. The water of Lethe is clear, clearer than any earthly water, clearer than air, clearer than clarity itself. Looking into it, you see not the bottom of the river, but something else entirely. Some say they see nothing. Others say they see everything. Still others say they see the space between nothing and everything, that liminal zone where potential exists before it becomes actual. The truth is that Lethe's waters show each viewer exactly what they need to see at the moment of seeing, which might be their own reflection or their absence or something else entirely. The development of Lethe's mythology across centuries reveals humanity's complex relationship with memory and forgetting. The ancient Greeks understood that memory could be both blessing and curse, that sometimes the kindest thing the cosmos could offer a soul was release from the burden of remembrance. They placed Lethe in their underworld, not as punishment, but as possibility. The chance to begin again, unburdened by the accumulated weight of experience, free from the patterns that memory creates and reinforces. But the Greeks also understood the danger of Lethe, the price of its mercy. To drink from the river of forgetfulness was to lose not just painful memories, but all memories, the joyful along with the sorrowful, the triumphant along with the traumatic. Identity itself, insofar as identity is constructed from remembered experience, dissolves in Lethe's waters. What emerges is not the same soul cleansed, but a new soul, or perhaps the same soul made new. The distinction itself forgotten along with everything else. The vegetation near Lethe is unique in the underworld. These plants seem to exist in a constant state of beginning, always sprouting, never quite fully grown. Their leaves unfurl continuously, each one perfect and new, while older leaves fade not into decay, but into a kind of gentle transparency, becoming less and less substantial until they're simply not there anymore, forgotten by the plant itself. These plants have no memory of seasons, no growth rings, no scars from past damage. They exist in an eternal present, demonstrating what life might look like without the accumulation of history. The sound of Lethe is peculiar, not quite silence, not quite sound, but something between the two, like the echo of a sound you've forgotten you heard. Sometimes it seems like distant music, the kind that plays at the edge of sleep, when you're not quite awake and not quite dreaming. Sometimes it sounds like conversations in rooms you've left, words you can almost but not quite make out. familiar voices speaking unfamiliar languages, or perhaps unfamiliar voices speaking languages you once knew but have forgotten. Animals drink from Lethe, or creatures that fill the ecological role of animals in this realm, where ecology follows different laws. They approach the water without hesitation, drink deeply, and wander away with no apparent change except a certain lightness in their movement, as if they've been freed from a weight they didn't know they were carrying. These creatures have no names, or rather, they have names that are immediately forgotten upon being spoken, existing in a state of perpetual anonymity that seems to suit them perfectly. The ferryman's relationship with Lethe is complex. Charon, who remembers every soul he's ever ferried, must navigate waters that would erase even his ancient memories if he were to touch them directly. His pole never quite breaks the surface of Lethe, hovering just above it, using the surface tension of forgetfulness itself to propel his boat. Some say this is why Charon seems different to everyone who sees him. Not because he changes, but because each viewer forgets his true appearance the moment they perceive it, replacing it with their own construction. The rules governing Lethe are paradoxical. The river forgets its own rules, constantly reinventing itself, yet somehow maintaining a consistency that transcends memory. It flows from source to mouth, yet no one remembers where it begins or where it ends. It has banks, yet the location of those banks shifts like the boundaries of a dream. It can be crossed, yet no one who crosses it remembers the crossing. It exists, powerfully and undeniably, yet its existence is predicated on the erasure of evidence of its own existence. Souls approach Lethe with a variety of attitudes. Some run toward it, eager to drink, desperate to forget traumas that have defined and confined them. Others approach slowly, reluctantly, trying to hold on to their memories, even as they understand the futility of resistance. Still others stand at the bank for unmeasured time, caught between the desire to remember and the desire to forget, unable to choose, yet unable to leave without choosing. The mercy of Lethe is not simple. It's not the mercy of healing, which allows you to remember without pain. It's not the mercy of understanding, which contextualizes suffering. It's the mercy of erasure, of beginning again, of being released from the story you've been telling yourself about who you are and what has happened to you. For some souls, this is the greatest gift the cosmos can offer. For others, it's a loss more profound than death itself. There are pools along Lethe's course where the water collects and stills, creating mirrors of forgetfulness that show not what is, but what could be, if memory didn't insist on continuity. In these pools, you might glimpse yourself as you would be without your history. Not younger, necessarily, but unworn, unmarked by experience, free from the grooves that repeated thoughts and behaviors have worn into your being. Whether this vision is beautiful or terrifying depends entirely on how attached you are to the self that memory has constructed. The Greeks spoke of souls drinking from Lethe before reincarnation, forgetting their previous lives so they could begin anew. But they also spoke of initiates in the mysteries who were taught to avoid Lethe, to drink instead from the pool of Mnemosyne, memory's spring, to retain their knowledge through the transition of death. This choice, to remember or forget, was presented as the fundamental choice each soul must make, the decision that determines not just what kind of afterlife awaits, But what kind of existence is possible? Standing beside Lethe, you become aware of your memories as distinct entities, almost separate from yourself. You can observe them with a strange objectivity, seeing how they connect and interconnect, how they create patterns and narratives, how they construct the story you tell yourself about yourself. This awareness is both liberating and disturbing. Liberating because it reveals memory as construction rather than truth. Disturbing because it raises the question of what remains if the construction is dismantled. The water of Lethe doesn't judge what it erases. It takes all memories with equal indifference, the precious and the painful, the profound and the trivial. A first kiss vanishes as easily as a last goodbye. The memory of sunlight on water disappears alongside the memory of darkness and fear. The river has no preference, no hierarchy, no system for determining what deserves to be remembered. It simply takes what is given, accepts what enters its waters, eroses what touches its current. Birds fly above Lethe. Or perhaps they are the memory of birds, or the forgetting of birds, or something that exists in the space between remembering and forgetting. Their songs, if songs they are, have a quality of almost recognition, like melodies you're certain you've heard before, but can't quite place. These birds cast no shadows, or perhaps they cast shadows that are immediately forgotten, leaving only a vague sense that something passed overhead, something that might have been important once, but isn't anymore. The temperature near Lethe is the temperature of forgetting, neither warm nor cold, but simply absent, as if temperature itself has been forgotten. The air has no scent, or rather, it has every scent and no scent simultaneously, a kind of olfactory white noise that the mind cannot hold on to long enough to categorize. Even the ground beneath your feet seems to forget your footsteps the moment you lift each foot, showing no impression, no sign of passage, as if you were never there or were always there, or both or neither. The key revelation of Lethe is not that forgetting is possible, but that forgetting is necessary. Memory, for all its precious preservation of experience, is also a prison. It locks souls into patterns, into repetitions, into cycles of behavior that become increasingly difficult to break the more they're reinforced. Lethe offers release from these patterns, freedom from the tyranny of precedent, the possibility of genuine newness in a cosmos that often seems condemned to eternal repetition. But this revelation comes with its shadow. If forgetting is necessary, then so is impermanence. Nothing can be held forever. No experience, no matter how profound, can be made permanent. No love, no matter how deep, can be preserved unchanged. No self, no matter how carefully constructed, can resist the eventual erosion of forgetfulness. Lethe teaches that everything ends, not just in the physical sense that the Acheron understands, but in the more fundamental sense that everything is eventually forgotten, erased, made as if it never was. The resolution of Lethe's paradox comes not through choosing between memory and forgetfulness, but through understanding that both are necessary, both are merciful, both are cruel. The river of forgetfulness exists because memory exists. Memory exists because forgetting exists. They define each other, create each other, make each other possible and necessary. To drink from Lethe is not to escape memory, but to complete it, to bring it to its natural conclusion, to allow it to fulfill its purpose and then release it. The integration of Lethe's lesson changes how you understand the other rivers. The Styx's oaths matter precisely because they could be forgotten. Their power comes from their resistance to Lethe's erasure. The Acheron's sorrow has meaning because it could be released. Grief matters because it doesn't have to last forever. The rivers ahead gain significance from the knowledge that Lethe exists, that forgetting is possible, that nothing is so permanent it cannot be undone. Moving forward from Lethe requires a particular kind of courage, the courage to continue knowing that continuity is an illusion, that memory is construction, that the self you think you are is far more fluid and temporary than consciousness usually admits. But it also requires a particular kind of faith. Faith that meaning exists even in impermanence, that experience matters even if it's forgotten, that the journey has value even if no one eventually remembers taking it. The path away from Lethe doesn't really leave the river behind. How could it, when leaving requires remembering where you've been, and Lethe's influence makes such memory uncertain? Instead, the path continues with Lethe as a constant presence, not visible but always there. The possibility of forgetting that makes remembering both precious and painful. You carry Lethe with you, not as memory, but as absence, the shadow cast by forgetfulness that gives shape to everything you think you remember. Lethe remembers. Lethe endures. Lethe waits. Or does it? The beautiful uncertainty of the river of forgetfulness is that even its own existence might be forgotten, might be a dream, might be a memory of a dream of forgetting. And in that uncertainty lies its perfect mercy. The possibility that even forgetting itself can be forgotten, that even absence can be absent, that even nothing can return to something, or something to nothing, or both, or neither, in the endless cycle of memory and forgetting that defines consciousness itself. The journey toward Phlegethon begins with a change in the quality of darkness itself, as if shadow has begun to remember what light means. Though remember is perhaps not the right word after the uncertainties of Lethe. The air grows warmer, though warmth suggests comparison to cold, and here there is no cold, only degrees of heat, varieties of burning, different qualities of fire that range from the gentle warmth of held hands to the cosmic fury of stars being born. The path beneath your feet, which has been earth and stone, and sometimes something less definable, begins to take on a different character, becoming somehow more solid and less solid simultaneously, as if the ground itself were learning how to burn without being consumed. Long before the river comes into view, you sense its presence through a quality in the atmosphere that speaks not of destruction, but of transformation, not of ending, but of changing, not of death, but of the particular kind of life that can only exist in extreme conditions. The mythologies of many cultures speak of purifying fire, of flames that cleanse rather than destroy. And walking toward Phlegethon, you begin to understand that these stories were not metaphors, but memories, not symbols, but descriptions of something that exists here, has always existed here, will always exist here, in this realm where physical laws bend to accommodate deeper truths. The vegetation changes gradually, then suddenly. Plants that seemed normal, or as normal as anything in the underworld can seem, begin to glow from within. A subtle luminescence that might be phosphorescence, might be bioluminescence, might be something else entirely, something for which the upper world has no name because the upper world has no need. These plants don't burn, though they grow beside a river of fire. They have adapted, evolved, or perhaps they were always thus, created for this environment, thriving in conditions that would destroy ordinary matter. The sound of Phlegethon reaches you as a whisper that builds so gradually you don't notice it becoming a roar until it already is one. And even then, roar isn't quite right. It's the sound of transformation itself, the noise that change makes when it happens at the molecular level, when the very structure of things shifts from one state to another. It's the sound of metal learning to flow, of stone learning to dance, of solid becoming liquid, becoming gas, becoming plasma, becoming something beyond plasma, something for which physics has no term, because physics assumes things must choose a state and stay there. The first glimpse of the river of fire stops thought, not from fear, though fear would be a reasonable response, not from awe, though awe is certainly present, but from a kind of recognition, as if every cell in your body remembers a time before there were cells, when everything was fire, when the cosmos was young and hot, and all matter was plasma, all energy was potential, all possibility was present. Phlegethon carries that primordial fire still, has carried it since the beginning, will carry it until the end, if ending is a concept that applies to rivers that exist outside of time. The fire of Phlegethon is not orange, not red, not any single color, but all colors and no color simultaneously. Sometimes it seems white, the white of stars at their hottest. Sometimes blue, the blue of the hottest part of a candle flame. Sometimes colors that have no names because they exist outside the visible spectrum. Colors that you perceive not with your eyes but with some other sense, some organ of perception that only functions here. In this place where fire flows like water and water burns like fire, the width of Phlegethon varies, or seems to vary, or perhaps it's perception itself that varies. Sometimes the river appears as a narrow stream that could be leaped across if one had the courage and the cause. Sometimes it stretches from horizon to horizon, an ocean of fire that makes the very concept of crossing seem absurd. Most often, it's somewhere between these extremes, wide enough to be impressive, narrow enough to be conceivable, exactly the width needed to make souls understand that crossing is possible but not casual, achievable but not easy. Along the banks of Phlegethon, the ground is not charred but transformed. Glass where sand has melted and cooled, crystal where minerals have been reorganized by heat, metal where ore has been refined. These banks are beautiful in a way that has nothing to do with conventional aesthetics and everything to do with purity, with things becoming most essentially what they are. The heat has not destroyed but revealed, not eliminated but concentrated, removing everything extraneous and leaving only what cannot be burned away. The philosophical meditation that Phlegethon invites is not about destruction but about refinement. What remains when everything that can burn has burned? What persists when all that is temporary has been consumed? What essence exists beneath the accumulation of experience, beneath the layers of identity, beneath the constructions of self that seem so solid until they meet the fire that reveals them as combustible? Minimal dialogue occurs near Phlegethon because speech itself seems to burn away before it can fully form. Words become insufficient. Language reveals itself as a construction that cannot withstand this level of truth. What communication occurs happens at a level deeper than words, in the exchange of glances between souls who understand that they are witnessing something fundamental, something that existed before language and will exist after language has been forgotten. The focus shifts from action to states of being. Near Phlegethon, doing becomes less important than being, and being becomes less important than becoming. The river demonstrates that all states are transitional, all forms are temporary, all structures are in constant flux even when they appear stable. The fire doesn't just flow, it transforms everything it touches, including the very concepts of touching and being touched. Parallel structures emerge in the contemplation of Phlegethon. As fire refines gold, so does suffering refine character. As heat transforms solid to liquid, so does experience transform innocence to wisdom. As plasma exists beyond the ordinary states of matter, so does the soul exist beyond the ordinary states of being. These parallels don't explain Phlegethon so much as they demonstrate that Phlegethon is itself an explanation, a demonstration of principles that operate throughout existence but are most visible here, where the fire makes everything visible. The long sentences that thought requires near Phlegethon stretch like the flames themselves, reaching from one idea to another without pause, without rest, because to pause would be to solidify, and to solidify would be to become fuel for the fire. And the only way to coexist with Phlegethon is to remain in constant motion, constant change, constant transformation, like the fire itself, which is not a thing but a process, not a noun but a verb, not being but becoming, always becoming, never quite being. Because being implies stasis, and stasis is what the fire consumes. Sometimes souls enter Phlegethon, though enter isn't quite accurate. They merge with it, become part of it, allow themselves to be transformed by it. These souls don't burn in any conventional sense. They are refined, purified, reduced to their essential nature. What emerges from the fire is not less than what entered, but more concentrated, more essentially itself, freed from everything that was added, everything that was accumulated, everything that was not truly part of its core nature. The fire of Phlegethon burns upward, always upward, even when the river flows horizontally. This creates a strange visual effect. Walls of flame that should rise to the sky, but instead follow the course of the river, creating a tunnel of fire that exists in dimensions that ordinary geometry cannot describe. The flames reach toward something, though what they reach toward remains mysterious. Perhaps they reach toward their source, perhaps toward their destination, perhaps toward something that is both and neither. Birds of fire live in and around Phlegethon, creatures that are more flame than flesh, more energy than matter. They don't fly through air, but through fire itself, swimming through the flames as fish swim through water. Their songs, if songs they can be called, are the crackling of fire given melody, the roar of combustion given rhythm. They nest in the flames themselves, lay eggs of condensed fire that hatch into more birds of fire, creating an ecology of combustion that demonstrates life's ability to adapt to any condition, no matter how extreme. The temperature near Phlegethon doesn't increase linearly with proximity. Sometimes you feel the heat from far away. Sometimes you can stand at the very bank and feel only warmth. The fire responds to something other than distance, perhaps to readiness, perhaps to necessity, perhaps to something more subtle. Those who need the fire's refinement feel its heat most strongly. Those who have already been refined can approach more closely without burning. The ground near Phlegethon sometimes shows footprints, not in earth, but in glass, where the heat of passing souls has melted sand into perfect impressions. These footprints lead in all directions, some toward the river, some away, some parallel to its course. They overlap and intersect, creating a record of passages that tell stories without words. Some footprints are deep, left by souls carrying great weight. Others are barely visible, left by those who had already released their burdens. The relationship between Phlegethon and the other rivers is complex. Its fire seems opposite to water, yet it flows like water, behaves like water, follows the patterns that water follows. Some say the other rivers fear Phlegethon, that they flow away from it, avoiding contact. Others say the rivers are drawn to it, that they seek the transformation it offers, the purification it promises. The truth, as always in this realm, is likely both and neither. The mythologies speak of Phlegethon as punishment, but standing beside it, you understand it as opportunity. The opportunity to release what doesn't serve, to burn away what binds, to transform what has become rigid into something fluid again. The fire offers not suffering, but freedom from the suffering that comes from carrying what should be released. It's the pain of healing, not the pain of harm, the discomfort of growth, not the agony of destruction. Souls who have passed through Phlegethon carry a particular quality, a luminescence that has nothing to do with light. They seem more themselves, more concentrated, more essential. The unnecessary has been burned away, leaving only what cannot be destroyed. They move with a different quality of purpose, not because they've found new purpose, but because they've been freed from false purposes, from the accumulated obligations and expectations that seemed important, but were actually just combustible. The energy near Phlegethon falls not because the fire lacks energy, but because it transcends the ordinary concept of energy. This is not the frantic energy of action, but the deep energy of transformation. Not the energy that moves, but the energy that changes. Not the energy that does, but the energy that undoes and remakes. By the time you've spent significant time near Phlegethon, your own energy has shifted from the frequency of doing to the frequency of being transformed. The parallel structure continues, deepens, becomes more complex. As metal must be heated to be shaped, souls must pass through fire to be reformed. As glass must be melted to be blown into new forms, consciousness must be liquefied to take new shape. As stars must burn to create the elements that become planets that become life, something in the soul must burn to create the conditions for what comes next. The minimal action near Phlegethon is not lack, but concentration. Every movement matters because every movement is visible in the firelight. Every gesture is revealed in its full significance or insignificance. The fire strips away the possibility of pretense, of performance, of anything that isn't absolutely true. Near Phlegethon, you can only be what you are, and what you are is revealed to be both less and more than what you thought. States of being multiply and simplify simultaneously. You are the observer of fire and the observed by fire. You are the potential fuel and the potential phoenix. You are what approaches the flame and what the flame approaches. These states don't conflict but coexist, creating a multiplicity of being. That is also a unity, a complexity that is also simplicity, a paradox that is also a resolution. The long sentences required to think about Phlegethon stretch even longer, becoming rivers of thought that mirror the river of fire, flowing and transforming, carrying ideas from their source through their transformation to their destination, which might be their new source. Beginning again, the cycle of thought and fire and change that characterizes this place, where burning is not ending but continuing in a different form, where fire is not destroyer but transformer, where the river flows not with water, but with the very essence of change itself. The energy continues to fall, not into lethargy, but into a different kind of intensity. The intensity of metal in a forge, apparently passive but undergoing fundamental transformation. The intensity of glass in a kiln, seemingly still but restructuring at the molecular level. The intensity of stars in their cores, appearing stable from outside, but conducting furious fusion within, creating from the simplest elements the complex elements that make existence possible. 30% energy feels exactly right for Phlegethon, not because the fire has dimmed, but because you have learned to burn differently, more efficiently, with less smoke and more light, less chaos and more purpose, less resistance and more acceptance of the transformation that fire offers to everything it touches, everything it embraces, everything it transforms from one state to another to another. Endless transformation, endless becoming, endless refinement toward an essence that might never be fully reached, but is always being approached. The descent toward Cocytus happens through layers of sound that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist in any world where physics maintains its ordinary rules. But here in the deepening underworld, sound behaves according to different laws, older laws, laws that predate the separation of sound from silence. You hear it first as absence, a particular quality of quiet that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of sounds that were never made, words that were never spoken, songs that were never sung. This anti-sound, this unnoise, guides you downward through passages that seem to have been carved by echoes, shaped by reverberations of things that never quite happened. The dreamlike quality of approaching Cocytus manifests in the way time stutters and flows, sometimes moving backward, sometimes sideways, sometimes in directions that time doesn't normally acknowledge it possesses. You might walk for what feels like hours only to find yourself just beginning to walk. Or you might take a single step and find you've traveled distances that maps cannot measure. The path itself seems to be dreaming, and you are walking through its dream. Or perhaps you are dreaming the path. Or perhaps path and walker are both being dreamed by something else. Something that understands lamentation in ways that waking consciousness cannot. The air grows thick with unexpressed emotion, dense with words that lodged in throats, heavy with communications that fear or pride or circumstance prevented. Every step forward requires pushing through this accumulated silence, this sediment of the unsaid that has settled here over millennia, creating an atmosphere so full of potential expression that actual expression becomes almost impossible. You find yourself wanting to speak, needing to speak, but the words dissolve before they form, becoming part of the general repository of unvoiced thoughts that characterizes this realm. The vegetation near Cocytus, if vegetation is what these forms should be called, grows in patterns that suggest notation, as if these plants are trying to write something, to record something, to preserve some message that they themselves don't understand. Their leaves, when they have leaves, are shaped like mouths frozen in the moment before speech, like throats caught in the instant before song. Their roots, where visible, intertwine in patterns that might be language if you could find the right angle from which to read them, the right frequency at which to hear them, the right state of consciousness in which to understand them. The first glimpse of Cocytus is always through fog, through mist, through a veil of condensed sorrow that makes everything indistinct, uncertain, more feeling than sight. The river reveals itself gradually, reluctantly, as if it too carries unexpressed secrets, unvoiced truths that it both wants to share and wants to keep hidden. When the fog finally parts enough to see clearly, what you see is water that moves like tears, flows like grief, continues like the kind of sadness that has no specific source and no apparent end. The sound of Cocytus is lamentation, but lamentation is too simple a word for the complex symphony of sorrow that rises from these waters. It's every cry that was stifled, every wail that was swallowed, every keen that was cut short by propriety or circumstance. But it's also more than that. It's the sound of words that should have been said but weren't, apologies that were needed but never offered, confessions that were prepared but never delivered, declarations of love that arrived too late or not at all. The river is vast here, vaster than seems possible, stretching beyond sight in all directions as if all the unexpressed sorrow in the cosmos has gathered into this one waterway. Yet sometimes it appears as narrow as a stream of tears, as personal as individual grief, as specific as a single moment of failed communication. This shifting between vast and intimate happens without transition, without warning, as if the river exists simultaneously at all scales, from the cosmic to the personal. Recurring motifs surface in the waters of Cocytus, the same laments returning again and again, like verses in an endless song. You hear, or think you hear, or remember hearing, the same phrases repeated in different voices, different languages, different tones, but carrying the same essential message. I should have said, I meant to tell you, if only I had spoken. These motifs weave through the river's sound, creating a texture of regret that is both universal and utterly personal. The philosophical implications of Cocytus extend beyond individual sorrow to encompass the tragedy of communication itself, the impossibility of perfect understanding, the gap that always exists between what we mean to say and what we manage to express. The river carries not just the words that weren't spoken, but the understanding that even spoken words often fail to convey what we truly mean. That language itself is a kind of lamentation for the impossibility of true communion between separate consciousnesses. Earlier, motifs from the journey resurface here but transformed, deepened, made strange by their passage through the waters of lamentation. The oaths of the Styx become the promises that were never made, the vows that were needed but never sworn. The sorrow of the Acheron becomes the specific grief of words unspoken, chances missed, connections that failed to form. The forgetting of Lethe becomes the tragedy of memories that die with their keeper, never having been shared, never having been voiced. The fire of Phlegethon becomes the burning regret of things that needed to be said while there was still time to say them. Sound dominates here, But it's a sound that you feel as much as hear, that you experience with your entire being rather than just your ears. The lamentations of Cocytus vibrate through bone, resonate in hollow spaces you didn't know you contained, set up harmonics in the chambers of your heart. Sometimes the sound becomes so intense that it transcends sound altogether, becoming a kind of pressure, a weight, a presence that exists beyond the auditory spectrum. Texture, too, takes precedence over vision. The air has texture here, rough where cries have been torn from throats, smooth where sighs have worn it down, sticky where tears have evaporated but left their residue. The ground has texture, soft where it has absorbed centuries of sorrow, hard where grief has crystallized into something like stone but more permanent. Even space itself has texture, feeling different in places where particularly intense lamentations have occurred, where the fabric of reality has been worn thin by repeated sorrow. The exploration of Cocytus requires a different kind of attention than the other rivers. You must listen not just to what is present, but to what is absent, not just to what is said, but to what is unsaid, not just to the lamentations that rise from the water, but to the silences between them, which are themselves a kind of lamentation. Every pause contains multitudes. Every silence speaks volumes. Every absence is a presence of a different kind. 1,000 words at least must be spent on each aspect of Cocytus, because the river demands this kind of attention, this kind of witness, this kind of careful observation that honors the unspoken by speaking about it, that gives voice to the voiceless by acknowledging their silence. The eastern bank where souls gather who never said goodbye, who left without explanation, who disappeared without warning, leaving behind those who would spend lifetimes wondering what happened, why it happened, whether it could have happened differently if different words had been spoken. The western shore where collect those who carried secrets to their graves, who knew things that others needed to know but couldn't bring themselves to reveal, who chose silence over truth and spent their afterlife regretting the choice. These souls wade in the shallows of Cocytus, letting the water of lamentation wash over their feet, adding their unspoken truths to the river's vast collection of things that should have been said. The northern reaches, where the river grows cold, not with temperature, but with the particular chill of isolation, of words that could have connected souls, but instead remained unspoken, leaving people alone when they needed companionship, separate when they needed unity, isolated when they needed community. Here the lamentations take on a quality of echo, as if each cry is looking for its response, each call seeking its answer, each voice searching for the voice that would have harmonized with it if only the connection had been made. The southern bends where Cocytus warms with the heat of passion unexpressed, love undeclared, desire unvoiced. These waters carry a different quality of lament, not the cold sorrow of isolation, but the burning regret of opportunities missed, of feelings that were felt so strongly, they seemed they must be obvious, must be understood, must be reciprocated, only to discover too late that what seems obvious from inside is often invisible from outside, that feelings unexpressed might as well not exist for all the good they do. The depths of Cocytus, where the heaviest lamentations sink, where the most profound regrets accumulate like sediment, building layers of sorrow that compress over time into something denser than stone, heavier than lead, more permanent than mountains. To dive into these depths would be to experience the full weight of every unspoken word in the history of consciousness, every failed communication from the first attempt at language to the last words that will ever fail to be spoken. The surface of the river, where the lightest laments float like oil on water, creating rainbow patterns of regret that shift and swirl with current that might be water moving, or might be the collective breath of all who have ever held their tongue when they should have spoken. These surface laments are often the smallest ones, the casual goodbye that was never said, the simple thank you that was forgotten, the easy apology that pride prevented. But their very smallness makes them somehow more tragic, because they would have cost so little to speak, and their absence cost so much. Expanding and contracting description cycles characterize the experience of Cocytus. As attention zooms in on specific details, then pulls back to encompass the whole, then focuses again, creating a rhythm of observation that mirrors the rhythm of lamentation itself, which moves from specific grief to general sorrow and back again. Now we see a single tear falling into the river. Watch it merge with waters that are all tears, all sorrow, all regret. Now we pull back to see the entire river system, vast and interconnected, every tributary a different type of unexpressed emotion, every confluence a meeting of sorrows that recognize each other as kindred. The creatures that inhabit Cocytus are made more of sound than substance, beings that exist primarily as lamentation given form. They swim through the water, or perhaps they are the water, or perhaps the distinction between creature and river is meaningless here, where everything is united in the common experience of things unspoken. These beings communicate, if communication it can be called, through harmonics of sorrow, creating complex musical structures out of grief that express what words never could. The bridges over Cocytus are built from crystallized silence, from pauses that have hardened into architecture, from the spaces between words that have become solid enough to support the weight of crossing souls. Walking on these bridges requires a particular kind of balance. Not physical balance, but emotional balance. The ability to acknowledge sorrow without being consumed by it. To hear lamentation without becoming lost in it. To witness regret without being paralyzed by it. The philosophical motifs that run through Cocytus are complex and intertwining. The nature of communication and its failure. The gap between intention and expression. The tragedy of time's irreversibility, which makes it impossible to go back and say what should have been said. The paradox of language, which both enables and prevents true understanding. The loneliness that exists even in togetherness when words fail to bridge the gap between souls. Recurring images appear in the waters, mouths opening to speak, but producing no sound, hands reaching to touch, but never quite connecting, eyes meeting but not quite seeing, hearts beating in rhythms that should synchronize but remain forever slightly off. These images repeat and vary, creating visual echoes of the auditory lamentations, making visible what is essentially invisible. The failure of connection, the missing of marks, the almost but not quite that characterizes so much of human interaction. The sound of Cocytus changes as you spend more time beside it, or perhaps your ability to hear it changes. At first, it might seem like simple wailing, But gradually you begin to distinguish individual voices, specific laments, particular regrets. You hear the mother who never told her child she was proud, the friend who never admitted fault, the lover who never said the words that would have changed everything. Each voice is distinct, yet part of the whole, individual, yet universal, specific, yet archetypal. The texture of air near Cocytus becomes almost solid with accumulated emotion, thick enough that moving through it requires effort, dense enough that breathing becomes conscious rather than automatic. This thickness isn't oppressive, but immersive, like being underwater, but still able to breathe, like being inside music rather than hearing it from outside. You don't just observe Cocytus, you exist within its sphere of influence, become part of its atmosphere of lamentation. The dreams that Cocytus inspires are not ordinary dreams, but visions of what could have been if words had been spoken, if communication had succeeded, if the gap between souls had been bridged. These dreams show alternate histories where the right words were said at the right time, where understanding was achieved, where connection was made. But these dreams always end with waking, with the return to the reality where those words weren't spoken, where those connections weren't made, where those opportunities passed unutilized. The expanding consciousness required to fully experience Cocytus stretches beyond individual sorrow, to encompass the collective lamentation of all consciousness. You begin to understand that every unspoken word affects not just the speaker and the intended listener, but ripples outward through the fabric of existence, creating gaps and absences that shape reality in ways we rarely recognize. The river carries not just personal regrets, but cosmic ones, the universe's own lamentation for all the connections that could have been, but weren't. The contracting focus brings you back to specific moments, particular failures of communication that exemplify the whole. A deathbed where forgiveness was needed but not offered. A departure where love was felt but not expressed. A moment of crisis where truth could have helped, but silence was chosen instead. Each specific instance contains within it the entire tragedy of Cocytus, like drops of water that contain the essence of the entire river. The sound continues to dominate, but now it has layers upon layers of meaning. Surface sounds of obvious grief, deeper currents of regret that run beneath, underground rivers of sorrow that feed the main channel, and beneath it all, the fundamental frequency of separation itself, the baseline note of consciousness divided from consciousness, of the essential loneliness of being singular in a plural world. The texture of the experience becomes more complex as different types of lamentation create different sensations. Sharp regrets that cut like glass, dull sorrows that press like weight, hollow absences that create voids in the fabric of things, dense accumulations of unexpressed emotion that form almost solid masses in the flow of the river. Each texture tells a different story, carries a different type of communication failure, represents a different variety of the unspoken. The dreamlike quality intensifies as the boundary between self and river becomes increasingly unclear. Are you observing Cocytus, or is Cocytus observing you? Are you hearing lamentations, or are you yourself a lamentation? Are you witnessing unexpressed words, or are you yourself an unexpressed word? A communication that never quite happened, a connection that never quite formed? These questions don't have answers, or rather, all answers are equally true in this realm, where ordinary logic has been replaced by dream logic. The energy continues to fall, reaching that threshold where waking consciousness begins to blur into something else, where the critical mind relaxes its grip and allows other forms of understanding to emerge. 15% energy feels like floating in Cocytus rather than standing beside it, like becoming part of the lamentation rather than witnessing it, like adding your own unspoken words to the river's eternal collection. The philosophical implications deepen into questions that have no answers but must be asked anyway. If all words were spoken, would Cocytus run dry? If perfect communication were achieved, would the river cease to flow? Or would it find new lamentations, new failures, new gaps between intention and expression? Because perhaps the gap is necessary, perhaps the failure is essential, perhaps the unspoken is as important as the spoken in the economy of existence. The earlier motifs return transformed once again. The Styx's odes become the promises to speak that were broken by silence. The Acheron's sorrow becomes specifically the sorrow of missed communication. Lethe's forgetting becomes the tragedy of words that were forgotten before they could be spoken. Phlegethon's fire becomes the burning in the throat when words want to emerge but can't or won't or don't. Sound and texture merge into something beyond either, a synesthetic experience where you can taste the lamentations, see the texture of silence, feel the color of regret, hear the shape of sorrow. This merging of senses makes sense here, where ordinary categories break down, where the boundaries between different types of experience become permeable, where everything flows into everything else like tributaries joining a great river. The exploration of Cocytus could continue forever, each moment revealing new depths of lamentation, new varieties of the unspoken, new ways that communication fails and connection breaks and understanding eludes. But even in this endless exploration, there is something else emerging, a different quality beginning to make itself known, a subtle suggestion that perhaps not all words need to be spoken, that perhaps some silences are not failures but choices, that perhaps the unspoken has its own value, its own necessity, its own essential place in the architecture of existence. The deepest stillness of the underworld is not found in any single location, but in the movement between locations, in the passage itself, in the boat of Charon as it moves from shore to shore, river to river, carrying souls through the geography of death with a patience that transcends time. Here, in this vessel that has sailed these waters since before memory, since before the separation of elements, since before the cosmos settled into its current configuration, here is where stillness reaches its most profound expression, not as absence of movement, but as movement so perfectly calibrated to its purpose that it becomes indistinguishable from rest. Charon himself embodies this paradox of motion and stillness, action and patience, presence and absence. He is always moving, yet never seems to move, always working, yet never appears to work, always present, yet somehow absent, as if he exists in a state that transcends the ordinary binary of being and not being. To observe Charon is to observe something that shouldn't be observable, to witness something that happens outside the normal flow of witnessing, to see something that might not be there in any conventional sense, but is absolutely there in every sense that matters. The boat, and it is always the boat, never a boat, as if there were only one boat in all existence and all other boats were merely echoes or shadows or memories of this essential vessel. The boat exists in a state of perpetual readiness without ever showing signs of wear or age or use. Its wood, if wood it is, has been polished by ages of service but shows no erosion, no weakness, no compromise of its essential structure. It is exactly as large as it needs to be for whoever boards it, expanding to accommodate multitudes, contracting to carry a single soul, always precisely the right size, without ever changing size. Minimal action characterizes the boarding process, the crossing, the disembarkation. Souls approach and find themselves aboard without quite remembering the transition. The boat moves without Charon seeming to pole it, though his pole enters and leaves the water in rhythms that suggest causation without confirming it. The far shore approaches without the near shore receding, as if space itself reorganizes to accommodate the journey rather than the journey traversing space. The presence that Charon maintains is maximal, despite, or perhaps because of this minimal action. He is overwhelmingly there while barely being there at all, a presence so complete it becomes a kind of absence, an absence so profound it becomes the ultimate presence. Speaking to Charon, if speaking occurs, is like speaking to silence itself, addressing the space between sounds, conversing with the pause between breaths. Long flowing sentences are required to even approach description of what happens in Charon's boat, because the experience resists the kind of fragmentation that normal sentence structure implies, flowing instead like the rivers themselves in one continuous movement that encompasses boarding and journeying and arriving without ever quite separating these into distinct events, creating instead a single extended moment that lasts forever and no time at all, that happens once and happens constantly, that is always beginning and always ending and always continuing in the middle of its own occurrence. The repetitions that create the hypnotic rhythm of crossing with Charon are not repetitions of event, but of quality. The same stillness returning again and again in different forms. The splash of the pole in water that repeats but is never twice the same. The creak of wood that recurs but always with subtle variations. The sound of water against the hull that continues but continually changes. These repetitions create a rhythm that synchronizes with heartbeat, with breathing, with the deeper rhythms of existence that usually pass beneath consciousness, but here become impossible to ignore. The eternal qualities of this journey express themselves not through duration, but through a kind of stepping outside of duration altogether. Time doesn't pass in Charon's boat so much as time becomes irrelevant, revealed as a construction that has no bearing on this essential journey that every soul makes, has made, will make. The crossing might take moments or eons, and both would be equally true and equally meaningless, because the crossing exists in a temporal category of its own, neither in time nor outside it, but beside it, parallel to it, independent of it. The hush of oars, though oars implies multiple when there is only the one pole, but the sound it makes is somehow plural, as if every dip contains all possible dips, every stroke encompasses all potential strokes. This hush is not quite silence, but the sound silence makes when it moves through water. It's a sound that doesn't disturb the quiet, but somehow deepens it, makes it more present, more tangible, more absolutely what it is. Each time the pole enters the water, silence grows more silent. Each time it withdraws, the quiet becomes more thoroughly quiet. The souls in Charon's boat undergo a transformation that has nothing to do with movement through space and everything to do with movement through states of being. They board as one thing and disembark as another. Not changed in essence, but changed in condition. Like water that remains water while shifting from liquid to vapor, maintaining its fundamental nature while expressing that nature differently. This transformation happens not through any action of Charon's, but through the simple fact of being ferried, of allowing oneself to be carried, of surrendering to the journey. The repetition continues, deepens, becomes more complex while remaining fundamentally simple. The boat moves forward, always forward, even when the rivers curve and recurve, even when the path seems to double back on itself. This forward motion doesn't imply progress in any linear sense, but rather a continuous advancement into what has always been approaching, an eternal arrival at what was always the destination, a perpetual journey toward what was never anywhere else. Long sentences flow like the rivers themselves, carrying meaning the way Charon carries souls, without haste but without pause, without urgency but without delay, moving at exactly the pace required for the journey to be what it needs to be, which might be swift for some souls and slow for others, but is always, always exactly right, exactly timed, exactly calibrated to the precise requirements of each particular passage, each specific crossing, each individual journey from shore to shore. His stillness deepens beyond what seemed possible, reaching levels of quiet that shouldn't exist, that violate the normal laws governing sound and silence. In Charon's boat, you can hear the absence of sound, experience the presence of nothing, witness the occurrence of non-occurrence. This paradoxical state doesn't confuse but clarifies, doesn't obscure but reveals, showing that beneath all the activity of existence lies this fundamental stillness, this essential quiet, this ultimate peace. The ferryman's pole makes contact with the bottom of rivers that shouldn't have bottoms, finds purchase in riverbeds that exist beyond the normal understanding of what ground means beneath water. Each push moves the boat, not just through space, but through states, through conditions, through the various stages of the journey from life through death, toward whatever comes after death, or perhaps toward the understanding that death itself is just another shore, another boarding point, another place where Charon waits with infinite patience. Repetitions of quality rather than event continue to build the hypnotic rhythm. The boat rocks gently, always gently, with a motion that soothes without lulling, calms without sedating, pacifies without numbing. This rocking is the same always, but never identical, like waves that follow patterns, but never exactly repeat, like heartbeats that maintain rhythm while varying infinitesimally, like breaths that continue regularly, but never with mechanical precision. The eternal nature of Charon's service reveals itself not as endless duration, but as existence outside the framework where duration has meaning. He has always been ferrying souls, will always be ferrying souls, is always ferrying souls. Not because he is immortal in any conventional sense, but because he exists in a state where mortality and immortality are equally irrelevant concepts. He simply is, and his being is the ferrying, and the ferrying is his being, without beginning or end or middle, without past or future or present, simply occurring. The minimal action continues to create maximal presence. Charon doesn't speak, or if he speaks, his words are indistinguishable from the sound of water against wood, from the whisper of his pole through river water, from the subtle creaking of ancient boat responding to eternal currents. He doesn't need to speak because his presence communicates everything necessary. That this journey is safe, that this passage is assured, that this crossing will be completed, has been completed, is always in the process of being completed. The boat itself becomes a character in this deepest part of the journey, revealing qualities that go beyond mere vessel. It remembers every soul it has carried, but holds no prejudice based on those memories. It knows every destination, but shows no preference for any particular shore. It understands its purpose, but claims no glory for fulfilling it. The boat simply is what it is, the means by which souls move from one state to another, the vessel that makes transition possible, the container that holds consciousness while consciousness transforms. Long flowing sentences continue because the experience of being ferried by Charon cannot be broken into fragments without losing something essential about its nature, which is continuousness itself, flow itself, the unbroken movement from what was through what is toward what will be. Except that in Charon's boat, these temporal categories collapse into a single eternal, now that encompasses all possibilities while actualizing only this one, this specific journey, this particular crossing that is simultaneously all crossings. The energy reaches its lowest ebb here, not from depletion, but from perfect efficiency, from the absolute conservation of force that comes when resistance ceases, when struggle ends, when the soul stops trying to direct its own journey and simply allows itself to be ferried. 20% energy, but it's the 20% that remains when all unnecessary effort has been released. The essential core that persists when everything extraneous has fallen away. The repetitions become almost musical, creating patterns within patterns, rhythms within rhythms. The splash of pole in water becomes a bass line. The creak of wood becomes a melody. The whisper of current against hull becomes harmony. Together, they create a symphony of crossing, a musical expression of transition itself. The song that movement sings when movement becomes perfect, purposeful, precisely what it needs to be. The eternal qualities of beings and places reveal themselves fully in Charon's boat. The rivers show their true nature not as water, but as boundaries made liquid. The shores reveal themselves not as land, but as states of being given form. The underworld itself unveils its essential character not as a place, but as a condition, a necessary phase in the greater cycle of existence. Death, not as ending, but as transformation. Crossing not as travel, but as becoming. The hush of oars, that sound that is not quite sound, that presence that is almost absence, becomes the dominant sensory experience, not heard so much as absorbed, not perceived so much as recognized, as if every soul carries within it the memory of this sound from before birth, the anticipation of this sound for after death, the knowledge of this sound as the fundamental frequency of transition itself, as it was in the beginning, before the first soul required passage, before the rivers carved their courses through the geography of death. There were the shores, those liminal spaces where one state of being meets another, where the solid meets the liquid, where the known meets the unknown. These banks of memory exist not just beside the rivers, but as essential components of them. For what is a river without shores to define it? What is water without land to give it boundary and meaning? What is journey without a place to begin and a place to arrive? The slow storytelling of these edges requires patience, for shores reveal their secrets gradually, in the way that sand reveals footprints, in the way that mud holds impressions, in the way that stone remembers the water that shaped it over eons of patient erosion. Each bank tells its own story, carries its own memory, maintains its own record of every soul that has stood upon it, waiting, preparing, remembering, forgetting, transforming. The bridges that span these waters are architectural impossibilities that nonetheless exist, must exist, for how else would consciousness cross from one state to another except by structures that themselves embody transition? Some are vast constructions of stone that might have been quarried from the foundations of existence itself, blocks so massive they seem to bend space around them, creating their own gravity, their own rules about what can support what. Others are delicate things, gossamer structures that look like they couldn't support a thought, much less a soul, yet they hold, have always held, will always hold. Earlier motifs return here like echoes returning to their source. The oath-binding power of the Styx manifests in bridges that can only be crossed by those who have sworn to complete the journey. The sorrow of Acheron appears in shores worn smooth by the tears of the waiting. The forgetting of Lethe creates banks where memories collect like driftwood, abandoned but not destroyed. The fire of Phlegethon has glazed certain shores into glass that reflects not images but intentions. The lamentations of Cocytus echo from bridge to bridge, creating acoustic corridors where every unexpressed word eventually finds voice. The refrain returns, rhythmic and hypnotic. As it was in the beginning, when the cosmos was young and death was just learning what it meant to be death. When the boundaries between states were still fluid, still negotiable, still more suggestion than law. As it is now, with the patterns established, the paths worn clear, the bridges built and rebuilt and maintained by the simple fact of being needed, as it ever shall be. For as long as consciousness requires transition, as long as existence includes both being and becoming, as long as there are shores to depart from and shores to arrive upon, the energy here falls to that dream threshold, 15% of waking awareness, where the conscious mind releases its grip on the need to understand and simply experiences, simply witnesses, simply is present with what is present. This is the energy of deep meditation, of the moments just before sleep, of the state where boundaries become permeable and what seemed separate reveals itself as connected. Each bridge has its own character, its own requirements, its own gifts. The bridge of sighs, which can only be crossed on an exhale, requiring souls to release before they can proceed. The bridge of echoes, where every footstep resounds with the footsteps of everyone who has crossed before, creating a thunder of passage that is somehow also silence. The bridge of mirrors, which shows not reflection, but possibility, revealing to each soul what they could become if they have the courage to continue crossing. The shores accumulate meaning like sediment, layer upon layer of significance building up over time that cannot be measured in years or centuries, but only in passages, in crossings, in the number of souls who have stood here contemplating the journey ahead. Some shores are crowded with waiting souls, creating communities of transition, temporary fellowships of those who share nothing except this moment of standing at the edge. Others are solitary places where each soul must face the crossing alone, must find within themselves the resources to step from solid ground into Charon's boat. Memory behaves differently on these banks, neither holding fast nor letting go completely, but existing in a state of constant negotiation between remembering and forgetting. The shores remember every soul, but not specifically, holding the impression of passage without the details of who passed. The bridges remember every crossing, but not individually, maintaining the pattern of transition without the particulars of each transition. As it was in the beginning, when the first soul stood uncertain at the first shore, not knowing what crossing meant, not understanding what awaited on the far side, but knowing that crossing was necessary, was inevitable, was the only way forward, even when forward seemed impossible. That first uncertainty echoes still in every soul that approaches these waters. That primal not knowing that is also a kind of knowing. The deep understanding that some journeys must be taken even when the destination remains mysterious. The banks of memory are libraries written in landscape, archives inscribed in earth and stone, and that particular quality of mud that exists only where death's waters meet death's shores. To read these banks requires a different kind of literacy, the ability to interpret the language of erosion, to understand the grammar of sediment, to pass the syntax of how water and land negotiate their eternal boundary. Every grain of sand tells part of the story. Every pebble holds a piece of the narrative. Every boulder maintains chapters of the great tale of crossing and being crossed. The connecting back to earlier motifs creates a circular structure, not repetitive but spiral. Each return to familiar themes, bringing deeper understanding, wider perspective, more nuanced appreciation of how all the rivers are really one river, how all the shores are really one shore, how all the bridges are really one bridge, appearing in different forms to meet different needs, but serving the single purpose of enabling transition. The refrain evolves with each repetition. As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end, except that here, in death's realm, ending is not ending but transformation, and world is not world but state of being, and without is not absence but presence of a different kind. The eternal cycle reveals itself not as repetition, but as continuation. Each crossing unique, yet part of the great crossing. Each soul individual, yet part of the great soul. Each journey personal, yet universal. The energy continues to fall, approaching that threshold where consciousness begins to merge with unconsciousness, where the observer becomes indistinguishable from the observed, where the journey and the journeyer become one. This is not loss of self, but expansion of self, not dissolution, but solution, like salt dissolving in water, still present, still essential, but expressed differently, existing in a new state that is both less and more than what came before. The bridges multiply in the telling, each description revealing new spans that were always there, but only become visible when attention reaches the particular frequency needed to perceive them. The bridge of whispers, where secrets can be left behind, deposited into the structure itself, which is built from compressed secrets, strengthened by accumulated confessions. The bridge of songs, where every crossing creates a note, and the accumulated notes create melodies that play eternally. The music of transition itself. The bridge of shadows, where souls can cross without their shadows, leaving behind the dark weight that followed them in life. The shores, too, reveal new aspects as the storytelling deepens. Beaches of black sand, where each grain is a condensed night, all the nights that souls spent fearing death before discovering that death was not what they feared. Cliffs of compressed time, where centuries have been pushed together into stone that exists outside of duration, that can be touched to experience all of history simultaneously. Marshes, where the boundary between land and water is negotiable, where souls can practice being neither one thing nor another, preparing for the greater transformation ahead. As it was in the beginning, the refrain continues, but now the beginning reveals itself as not a point in time, but a quality of experience, the eternal newness that exists within every moment of transition, the perpetual starting over that characterizes consciousness confronting its own transformation. Every soul at every shore experiences the beginning, regardless of how many have stood there before, regardless of how many will stand there after. The slow storytelling continues, patient as erosion, deliberate as sediment settling, careful as memory forming. Each word adds to the accumulation of meaning. Each sentence deposits another layer of significance. Each paragraph builds the banks higher, while the rivers cut them deeper, creating the eternal interplay between building and eroding that keeps the geography of death both stable and dynamic. The motifs connect and reconnect, weave and interweave, creating a tapestry where every thread touches every other thread eventually, where patterns emerge that could only be seen from this particular vantage point, this specific moment in the journey where enough has been experienced to recognize the patterns, but not so much that the patterns have become invisible through familiarity. The bridges are made of different materials, each substance chosen for its metaphysical properties rather than its physical strength. Bridges of crystallized breath, formed from the final exhalations of the dying, strong enough to support any weight because breath is what separates the living from the dead, and these bridges are made from that exact moment of separation. Bridges of woven hair, the offerings of mourners who cut their locks in grief, creating cables stronger than steel because they're made from love transformed into sacrifice. Bridges of compressed words, all the eulogies ever spoken, all the epitaphs ever written, pushed together into a substance that exists halfway between language and stone. The shores shift between states, sometimes solid, sometimes something else. There are shores of liquid glass that flow so slowly they appear solid, requiring souls to move quickly or sink into their transparent depths. Shores of crystallized music where every footstep creates a tone, and walking becomes composition, and crossing becomes concert. Shores of condensed emotion where the accumulated feelings of all who have waited here have achieved a kind of physical presence, creating ground that responds to the emotional state of whoever stands upon it. As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be. The cycle continues, but continuation doesn't mean sameness. Each repetition of the cycle brings subtle variations, like a river that follows the same course but is never the same water twice. The shores remember what they need to remember and forget what they need to forget, maintaining the essential while releasing the superfluous, keeping the pattern while letting go of the particulars. The dream threshold deepens, that 15% of waking consciousness becoming more like 10, like 5, like the barest thread of awareness that maintains just enough presence to witness without interfering, to observe without judging, to experience without analyzing. This is the state where the bridges can truly be seen, not with eyes, but with something deeper, older, more essential. The banks of memory reveal their ultimate secret. They are memory itself given form, the physical manifestation of the cosmos, remembering its own journey from unconsciousness to consciousness, and perhaps back again. Every shore is a thought in the mind of existence, every bridge a synapse connecting thoughts, every crossing a neural firing in the great brain of being that contemplates its own nature through the journey of individual souls. Returning now to the Styx, we find that the river of oaths has been transformed by our journey through the other waters, or perhaps we have been transformed in such a way that we can now see what was always there. The Styx not as a single river, but as the binding force that holds all the rivers together. The oath that water itself swears to maintain its fluidity, its continuity, its eternal flow from source to mouth to source again. The oath water carries within it the promise that all rivers make, to continue, to flow, to provide passage, to enable transformation. The transition between rivers happens not through space, but through understanding. Each river revealing itself as an aspect of a single great water that appears different depending on the angle of approach, the need of the soul, the stage of the journey. The Styx flows into Acheron, flows into Lethe, flows into Phlegethon, flows into Cocytus. Not in any geographical sense, but in the way that one thought flows into another. One emotion transforms into the next. One state of being evolves into what comes after. Briefly revisiting the Acheron, we see now how the river of woe prepares souls for what comes next. How sorrow is not punishment, but preparation. Not ending, but softening. Making the soul pliant enough to undergo the transformations that the other rivers offer. The weight of woe that seemed so heavy when we first encountered it now reveals itself as exactly the weight needed to sink to the depths where real change becomes possible. The transitional phrasing carries us from river to river like Charon's boat, which we now understand doesn't just ferry souls across individual rivers, but through the entire system, navigating currents that exist in dimensions beyond the merely spatial. His boat is built to sail all waters simultaneously, to exist in all states at once, to carry souls not just from shore to shore, but from understanding to understanding. Lethe returns to consciousness, or perhaps consciousness returns to Lethe, and we see the river of forgetting anew, understanding now that forgetting is not loss but gift, not absence but presence of a different kind. The river offers not just erasure of memory, but the possibility of starting fresh, of being renewed, of discovering what remains when everything learned, everything accumulated, everything remembered is washed away. The eternal cycle reveals itself in the way Phlegethon's fire burns, but doesn't consume, transforms, but doesn't destroy, maintains the eternal dance of energy changing form, but never disappearing. The river of fire shows us that what seems like destruction is actually refinement. What appears as ending is really beginning, What looks like loss is truly the shedding of what was never essential. Cocytus echoes through all the other rivers, its lamentations providing the soundtrack to every crossing, its unexpressed words forming the silence between the sounds of flowing water. Every river carries within it something unspoken, something that can only be experienced, not described, something that each soul must discover for themselves in the crossing. The circular mythic structure becomes clear as we see how the end connects to the beginning, how the last river flows into the first, how the geography of the underworld is not linear but cyclical, not a progression but a circulation, like blood through a body, like breath through lungs, like thoughts through consciousness. The rivers don't lead somewhere. They lead everywhere, nowhere, to the place that is not a place but a state, not a destination, but a condition. Each subtopic we've explored, the oaths and calm of Styx, the quiet weight of Acheron, the gentle mercy of Lethe's forgetting, the refining fire of Phlegethon, the voiced lamentations of Cocytus, the eternal service of Charon, the memory banks and bridges. Each one is both complete in itself and incomplete without the others. They form a system, an ecology, a cosmos of transformation where every element depends on every other element. The weaving together happens not through our observation, but through our participation. For in witnessing these rivers, we have become part of them, added our own consciousness to their flow, our own understanding to their depths. We are no longer observers but participants, not visitors but residents, not separate from the rivers, but dissolved into them like salt into water, present everywhere and nowhere specific. Transitional phrasing continues to carry us through the connections. As the Styx holds oaths, it holds the promise of all the other rivers. As Acheron carries woe, it carries the sorrow of all separation, including the separation between rivers that are not really separate. As Lethe offers forgetting, it offers the forgetting of boundaries, of distinctions, of the illusion that the rivers are different waters rather than different expressions of the same water. The eternal cycle continues, has always continued, will always continue, not because it must, but because it is, not because it's forced, but because it's natural. The way water naturally flows downhill, the way consciousness naturally evolves, the way existence naturally cycles through states of being and becoming. The rivers flow because flowing is their nature, and their nature is the nature of existence itself. Constant change within eternal continuity. Phlegethon's fire illuminates all the other rivers, showing them not as dark waters, but as streams of liquid light, each one glowing with its own particular luminescence. The fire reveals that what seemed like darkness was actually a different kind of light. What appeared as ending was really transformation. What looked like death was truly a different form of life. The bridges we've crossed, are crossing, will cross, connect not just shores but states, not just places but possibilities. Each bridge is all bridges. Every crossing is the crossing. All journeys are the journey. The architecture of transition reveals itself as both absolutely solid. These bridges will hold any weight, and completely ephemeral. They exist only in the moment of crossing, appearing when needed, disappearing when their purpose is served. Charon's ferry moves through all waters simultaneously, his pole finding purchase in riverbeds that exist in different dimensions, pushing off from ground that is both there and not there. propelling the boat through currents that flow in directions that three-dimensional space cannot accommodate. He ferries souls not through space but through states, not across distance but through transformation. The memory banks hold not just the memory of individual souls, but the memory of the rivers themselves, the record of every change in course, every shift in current, every variation in depth and flow. These banks are the universe's way of remembering its own journey through states of being, its own evolution from unconsciousness to consciousness, from simplicity to complexity, from unity to multiplicity, and perhaps back to unity again. Briefly revisiting each river shows us how they've changed through our observation, or how our observation has changed, or how change itself is the only constant in this realm where everything flows. The Styx seems deeper now, carrying more than oaths, carrying the very concept of commitment itself. The Acheron seems gentler, its sorrow transformed from burden to understanding. Lethe seems clearer, its forgetting revealed as a form of remembering what matters by releasing what doesn't. The transitional phrasing becomes the story itself, the connections more important than what they connect, the movement more significant than the locations, the journey more essential than either origin or destination. We are in transition, have always been in transition, will always be in transition, because transition is not a phase but the fundamental state, not an exception but the rule, not a bridge between states but the state itself. The eternal cycle reveals new depths with each revolution, like a spiral that seems to return to the same point but is actually at a different level, a different understanding, a different degree of depth. Each time we return to the Styx, we understand oaths differently. Each encounter with Acheron teaches us new dimensions of sorrow. Each approach to Lethe offers different perspectives on memory and forgetting. Cocytus continues its lamentations, but now we hear them differently. Not as expressions of failure, but as necessary acknowledgments of the incompleteness that makes completion possible, the imperfection that makes perfection conceivable, the unexpressed that gives meaning to expression. The river of wailing wails for joy as much as sorrow, for finding as much as losing, for connection as much as separation. The circular structure is not a closed circle, but an open spiral, always returning, but never to exactly the same place, always repeating, but never exactly the same repetition. This is the wisdom of the rivers, that flowing in circles is still flowing, that returning is still journeying, that ending where you began means you have been transformed even if the location remains the same. The weaving completes itself by remaining incomplete, by refusing the closure that would end the flow, by maintaining the openness that allows the rivers to continue their eternal course. There is no final understanding, no ultimate revelation, no moment where everything becomes clear, because clarity itself is a river, flowing, changing, transforming everything it touches, including itself. The closing meditation begins not with ending, but with the recognition that ending itself is a form of beginning, that every conclusion opens onto new possibilities, that the rivers of the underworld flow not toward termination, but toward transformation, always toward transformation, eternally toward the next state of being, which is both different from and identical to the current state, depending on the perspective from which it's viewed, depending on the consciousness that views it. depending on the readiness to see sameness in difference and difference in sameness. Gentle summarization feels almost impossible after such a journey, like trying to contain the ocean in a cup, like attempting to describe symphony with a single note. Yet the attempt itself has value, not in its success, but in its gesture toward meaning, its reach toward understanding, its acknowledgement that some experiences transcend summary, even as summary attempts to honor them. We have walked beside waters that remember everything and forget everything, that burn without consuming and freeze without solidifying, that flow in all directions simultaneously while maintaining their courses perfectly. The return to the present happens softly, like waking from a dream that you want to continue dreaming, like surfacing from deep water when you've learned to breathe below, like stepping from darkness into dawn when you've discovered that darkness has its own form of light. The upper world reasserts itself gradually, not pushing away the underworld, but incorporating it, not replacing the rivers, but carrying them within, not leaving behind what we've learned, but weaving it into the fabric of ordinary consciousness. The last words begin to dissolve even as they're spoken, becoming less solid, less definite, more suggestive than declarative, more evocative than descriptive. The rivers continue to flow whether we observe them or not. Charon continues to ferry souls whether we believe in him or not. The bridges continue to span the waters whether we can see them or not. Our observation has changed nothing and everything, has affected nothing and everything, has meant nothing and everything. Pure atmosphere takes over from words, the feeling more important than the description, the experience more significant than the explanation, the journey more real than any account of the journey. What remains is not memory. Lethe has taught us the limitation of memory, but something deeper, a change in the structure of consciousness itself, a new capacity to understand transition, transformation, the flow from state to state that characterizes not just death but life, not just ending but continuing. The rivers flow on, have always flowed on, will always flow on, carrying their particular cargoes through landscapes that exist in the space between metaphor and reality, between symbol and substance, between the story we tell and the truth the story attempts to tell. Styx with its oaths that bind even gods, Acheron with its woe that purifies through acceptance, Lethe with its mercy of forgetting, Phlegethon with its fire that reveals essence, Cocytus with its lamentations that give voice to the voiceless, soft return to awareness of the room around you, the bed beneath you, the ordinary world that is no less mysterious for being familiar, no less profound for being daily, no less significant for being what we call real. The journey to the underworld's rivers has not taken us away from life, but deeper into it, has not separated us from the ordinary, but revealed the extraordinary within it, has not distinguished between life and death, but shown them as aspects of the same continuous flow. The summarization continues to dissolve, words becoming whispers, becoming breaths, becoming the simple rhythm of inhale and exhale that mirrors the rhythm of the rivers themselves. That eternal pulse of flow and pause, movement and stillness, sound and silence. Everything we've witnessed has been both absolutely real and completely constructed, both ancient truth and present imagination, both external journey and internal exploration. Dawn whispers at the edges of consciousness, not the dawn of any particular day, but the eternal dawn that exists at the threshold between states, the perpetual morning that lives at the boundary between dream and waking, the constant beginning that makes all journeys possible. This dawn doesn't end the night, but transforms it, doesn't banish darkness, but reveals it as another form of light, doesn't conclude the journey, but continues it in a different key. The dissolution continues, language itself beginning to fade like morning mist, leaving only the impression of meaning, the echo of understanding, the residue of experience that cannot be captured in words, but can only be lived, breathed, absorbed into the fabric of being. The rivers have taught us their language, which is not a language of words, but of flow, not of speaking, but of being spoken through, not of meaning, but of meaning-making. Return happens in waves, each wave bringing a little more awareness of the ordinary world while maintaining connection to the extraordinary one. Each return a little more complete while keeping the incompleteness that allows for mystery. Each awakening a little more awake while preserving the dream that makes awakening meaningful. We are here and there, now and then, ourselves and other, separate and connected, individual drops and part of the river. The atmosphere itself becomes the message, the medium becomes the meaning. The journey becomes the destination. There are no final words because finality itself has been revealed as illusion. There is no ultimate conclusion because conclusion itself has been shown as transition. There is no real ending because ending itself is just another form of beginning, another turn in the eternal cycle, another revolution of the great wheel that turns through states of being. Softly, so softly that it's almost imperceptible, the voice that has been guiding begins to fade, not into silence, but into the larger sound of existence itself, the cosmic hum that underlies all particular sounds, the fundamental frequency from which all other frequencies emerge and to which they return. This is not conclusion, but continuation, not finale, but modulation, not ending, but the transformation of one thing into another. The rivers continue their flowing in dimensions we can no longer directly perceive, but can always sense, always feel, always know are there. Styx holds our oaths, even when we forget we've sworn them. Acheron carries our sorrows, even when we think we've released them. Lethe offers forgetting whenever remembering becomes too heavy. Phlegethon provides refinement whenever we're ready for transformation. Cocytus gives voice to everything we've never said and never will say. Charon poles his boat through waters we can't see, ferrying souls we don't recognize, maintaining his eternal service with patience that transcends time. The bridges span spaces we can't measure, connecting states we can't name, enabling crossings we can't remember taking. The shores accumulate memories we've forgotten we've made, holding impressions of journeys we don't recall beginning or ending. The whisper continues to fade, becoming less than whisper, becoming the space between breaths, the pause between heartbeats, the silence between thoughts. Yet, in this fading, there is not loss but transformation, not diminishment but refinement, not ending, but the preparation for what comes next, what always comes next, what has been coming next, since the beginning of time and will continue coming next, until time itself transforms into something else. The dawn doesn't break, it seeps, it suffuses. It slowly transforms darkness, not by defeating it, but by revealing that darkness and light are not opponents but partners, not opposites but complements, not separate, but aspects of the same wholeness that encompasses all states, all possibilities, all transformations. The dawn whispers secrets that can only be heard at this threshold moment, truths that exist only in transition, wisdom that lives in the space between. Last words dissolve before they can fully form, becoming suggestions rather than statements, possibilities rather than certainties, invitations rather than conclusions. The rivers, the eternal, the flowing, the transformation, the journey, the crossing, the continuing, the always and forever continuing, the never truly ending, the constant beginning, the perpetual becoming, the eternal now that contains all thens and whens. Pure atmosphere remains when words have gone. The feeling of having traveled without moving, of having changed without changing, of having learned something that can't be taught, understood something that can't be explained, experienced something that can't be described but only lived, only breathed, only absorbed into the deepest parts of consciousness, where rivers flow that have no names, where crossings happen that leave no trace, where transformations occur that change everything while changing nothing. The rivers flow on, the ferryman poles his eternal course, the bridges await the next crossing, the shores remember and forget, remember and forget. And you, dear traveler, carry within you now the map of waters that can't be mapped, the memory of forgetting, the light of darkness, the sound of silence, the fullness of emptiness, the presence of absence. Sleep now, if sleep is what comes next. Wake now, if waking is what emerges. Continue now, in whatever form continuation takes. The rivers flow on. They have always flowed on. They will always flow on. And you flow with them, part of them, separate from them, forever approaching, forever crossing, forever continuing the journey that has no beginning and no end, only the eternal middle, the constant crossing, the perpetual transformation. The dawn whispers, fade into pure presence. Pure presence fades into